A homeless teenager saves the life of a millionaire who is on the brink of death after being bitten by a venomous snake on the side of the road. With determination, skill, and courage, he does everything he can to get the man to a hospital in time. This is a touching story of two completely different lives crossing paths in a moment of crisis, one encounter that changes them both forever. Please let us know if you appreciate the video. Click like and subscribe to support us. The rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt filled the silence inside the luxurious Rolls-Royce Ghost as Richard Montgomery, a self-made millionaire, sped down the desolate countryside road outside of Nashville, Tennessee. The road was narrow, flanked by golden wheat fields stretching endlessly on either side. The city lights had long since faded into the distance, leaving nothing but open space and the darkening sky overhead. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, and the air carried the crisp scent of wild grass and earth. Richard, gripping the leather steering wheel, let out a deep breath. His jaw was tight, his mind racing. The meeting had been a disaster. A high-stakes deal, one that could have expanded his real estate empire, had fallen apart in the final moments. Investors backed out, legal complications arose, and for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was losing control. How long has it been since I stopped to breathe? He muttered under his breath. It had been a long time. Too long. Impulsively, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine's purr softened into silence as he stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against gravel. Before him, a vast golden wheat field swayed gently in the breeze, stretching toward the darkening sky. The sight was almost surreal, so different from the suffocating boardrooms and the glare of city lights he had grown used to. For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard allowed himself to simply stand still. The world felt quieter here. Simpler. Maybe this was what he needed, a moment away from everything. He took a slow step forward, then another, walking along the dirt path between the fields. His breathing steadied as he let the peace of the countryside wash over him. But just as he was beginning to feel a sliver of calm, pain. Sharp, searing, blinding pain shot up from his ankle, so sudden and violent that he stumbled backward with a strangled gasp. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breath hitched. Something had bitten him. Richard's eyes darted downward, and in the fading light, he caught a glimpse of it, a snake, its slender body slithering quickly into the grass, disappearing as if it had never been there. Then, his gaze fell to his ankle. Two small puncture marks. The pain was intensifying by the second, spreading through his leg like fire. His body tensed as realization hit him. Venom. Richard's breath turned ragged. He staggered, nearly losing his footing. Stay calm. Don't panic. But that was easier said than done. His fingers fumbled for his phone, hands slick with sweat as he pulled it from his pocket and pressed the screen. No signal. His chest tightened. He turned, forcing himself to move, dragging his injured leg as he stumbled back toward his car. Each step became harder. His vision blurred. His muscles felt weak. He barely made it 5 steps before his legs gave out beneath him. Richard collapsed onto the dirt path, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He needed help. Someone help. He tried to call out, but his voice was barely above a whisper. The countryside remained still, indifferent to his suffering. The wind rustled through the wheat fields, but there was no one to hear him. This isn't it? For all his wealth, power, and success, he was going to die alone in the middle of nowhere, poisoned by a snake. Darkness pressed in around the edges of his vision. His fingers dug into the dirt, but his strength was fading fast. Then, footsteps. Faint, but distinct. They grew closer, crunching softly against gravel. Richard forced his heavy eyelids open, struggling to focus. A silhouette appeared against the dim glow of the fading sunset, standing just a few feet away. A boy. Small, thin, dressed in a tattered hoodie and jeans that had clearly seen better days. His messy curls framed a face both young and sharp, and his dark eyes, though filled with caution, held a glimmer of intelligence. The boy took a hesitant step forward, scanning Richard's motionless body. Are you okay? He asked, his voice steady but wary. Richard tried to speak, but his tongue felt heavy. His breath rasped out instead a shallow, pained whisper. Snake, bite. The boy's expression shifted instantly. His gaze snapped to Richard's leg, scanning the wound with surprising focus and precision. Then, without a trace of hesitation, he dropped to his knees beside Richard. "You've been bitten by a snake," the boy muttered, mostly to himself. But there was no fear in his voice, only urgency. He moved quickly, his hands deft but controlled. "No panic. No hesitation. We need to act fast." Richard, barely clinging to consciousness, had no choice but to trust him. In the fragile moment between life and death, he never imagined that his only hope would lie in the hands of a homeless boy from the streets. The world around Richard Montgomery blurred into a haze of pain and darkness. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as the venom coursed through his veins, turning his limbs sluggish and heavy. His head lolled to the side, eyes barely open, watching as the boy in the hoodie crouched beside him, eyes locked onto his wound with intense focus. For a brief moment, Richard's fading mind clung to a single thought. Who is this kid? The boy Jordan Carter moved fast, but with a calmness that seemed out of place for someone so young. He wasn't panicking, wasn't hesitating. Instead, he was working. Jordan's fingers dug into his pocket, pulling out a frayed, slightly dirty bandana, the only piece of fabric he owned. He folded it quickly, forming a makeshift tourniquet. "I have to slow the venom down," he muttered to himself. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "If someone's been bitten, stop the venom from spreading. Tie something tight just above the bite, but not too tight. You don't want to cut off the blood completely." Jordan's hands moved with precision, tying the fabric around Richard's leg, about 2 inches above the wound. Twisted it tight. Richard let out a sharp groan, his body jolting slightly from the sudden pressure. "I know it hurts," Jordan said, his voice steady. "But you gotta stay awake, Mr. Richard forced his eyes open, his vision still swimming. He wasn't used to taking orders from anyone, much less a kid, but right now, he had no choice. The boy's hands didn't shake. His expression didn't waver. He knew what he was doing. Jordan looked around, his mind racing. No phone signal. No cars in sight. No help coming. He gritted his teeth. "I need to get you out here. But how?" Richard was twice his size. There was no way Jordan could carry him. His eyes darted toward the wheat field, scanning for anything useful. Nothing. Then he looked back toward the dirt road. It was empty. But if they could just get to the road, maybe someone would drive by. That was their best shot. Jordan pressed his palms against his knees, taking a deep breath. He had 2 options. Stay here and hope someone comes, or move Richard closer to the road, increasing their chances of being seen. The first option was too risky. If Richard passed out before help arrived, he might not wake up again. That left only one choice. Jordan turned back to Richard. "Mister, I'm gonna get you to the road, but you gotta work with me," he said firmly. "I can't carry you, but I can drag you. You understand?" Richard barely managed a nod. That was good enough. Jordan scanned the area and spotted a thick, fallen tree branch nearby, sturdy, about 4 feet long. He grabbed it and dragged it over, placing it beside Richard. "Okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but I need you to hold on to this," Jordan instructed, shoving the branch under Richard's arms. "I'm gonna pull from the other end. You just hold on and let me do the work." Richard didn't have the strength to argue. With a deep breath, Jordan gripped the other end of the branch and began pulling. It was hard. Richard's body was heavy, dead weight. The uneven ground made it worse. Every pull felt like he was dragging a boulder uphill. But Jordan didn't stop. His muscles burned. His breath came out in ragged pants. "Just a little further," he muttered to himself. The road was only about 50 feet away, but every inch felt like a mile. Behind him, Richard groaned in pain, his breath growing more labored. Jordan knew he was running out of time. He pulled harder. Just as Jordan's arms were about to give out, a sound split through the night. A low, distant rumble. Jordan's head snapped up. His heart pounded. Headlights. A truck was coming. For a split second, relief flooded his chest, but then they were too far from the road. Crap. Jordan gasped. If the driver didn't see them, they'd miss their only chance. With one final burst of energy, Jordan dropped the branch, sprinted toward the road, and threw himself into the truck's path. The headlights blazed into his face, momentarily blinding him. The truck wasn't slowing down. Jordan waved his arms frantically, shouting at the top of his lungs. Stop. Please. We need help. For a terrifying moment, it seemed like the truck wouldn't stop. Then. Tires screeched. The vehicle skidded to a halt, just inches from where Jordan stood. A man stepped out, his face shadowed under the truck's bright headlights. He looked to be in his 50s, with rough, calloused hands and a face weathered by years of hard labor. He wore a plaid shirt and worn-out jeans, looking every bit the farmer or working man. His gaze flickered from Jordan, sweating, breathing hard, desperation written all over his face, to Richard, lying motionless a few feet away. His brow furrowed. What in the hell's going on here? Jordan didn't hesitate. He's been bitten by a snake. He blurted out. He needs to get to a hospital now. Wow. The man's expression shifted instantly from suspicion to concern. Without another word, he rushed toward Richard, crouching beside him. Jesus. The man muttered, assessing Richard's condition. Jordan, still panting, grabbed his sleeve. Please, he begged. He doesn't have much time. The man didn't need any more convincing. All right, kid, he said, nodding sharply. Help me get him in the truck. Together, they lifted Richard, struggling under his weight, but managing to haul him into the back seat of the truck. The man slammed the door shut, then turned to Jordan. You getting in? Or what? Jordan didn't hesitate. He climbed into the truck, his heart still hammering in his chest. The man threw the truck into drive and floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped down the dirt road toward the nearest hospital. Jordan glanced at Richard. His breathing was weak, his face pale. Hold on, mister, Jordan murmured, his hands clenched into fists. You're not dying tonight. The truck tore through the countryside, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, the cab was filled with the tense hum of the engine, the occasional jolt of the wheels hitting uneven patches of road, and the ragged, uneven breathing of Richard Montgomery. Jordan sat in the back seat, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Richard's face was pale, his breaths shallow, his body barely responsive. Every passing second, the venom spread further. Across from him, James Carter, the farmer who had stopped to help, clenched the steering wheel, his face set in hard determination. How much longer? Jordan demanded, voice raw with panic. Nearest hospital's about 20 minutes out, James grunted, pressing his foot harder on the gas. We're gonna make it, kid. Just keep him awake. Jordan swallowed hard and turned back to Richard. Mr. Montgomery, he called, shaking the man's shoulder lightly. No response. His chest tightened. Simon, don't check out on me now. Richard's eyelids fluttered slightly, his lips parting just enough for a weak, barely audible murmur. Kid. Jordan leaned in closer, his heart pounding. Yeah, I'm here. Just hang on. Richard's breathing hitched. His lips moved again, but the words came out in a garbled slur. Jordan could barely make them out. Can't feel my leg. Jordan's stomach dropped. He pressed his fingers against Richard's pulse, point on his wrist weak, faint, barely there. This isn't good, he muttered under his breath. The venom was spreading faster than he expected. Jordan's mind raced. He didn't have medical tools. He was running out of time. But he did have knowledge. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Venom attacks the nervous system. If they stop responding to touch, it's spreading fast. You have to slow it down however you can. Jordan looked around the truck frantically, his eyes scanning for anything useful. Then he spotted a roll of duct tape sitting on the dashboard. Hey, give me that, Jordan shouted. James glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but didn't question it. He grabbed the roll and tossed it back. Jordan caught it, tearing off long strips with his teeth. What the hell are you doing? James asked. Securing his leg, Jordan muttered. If we can keep it from moving too much, it might slow the venom down. He worked fast, wrapping Richard's leg tightly, securing the makeshift tourniquet he had tied earlier with extra layers of support. Anything to slow the blood flow. Richard groaned weakly, but Jordan didn't stop. We're almost there, mister, he said. Just hold on. James pressed harder on the gas. 15 minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, in the distance, a cluster of red and white lights flickered the emergency entrance of a hospital. There it is, James barked. Kid, get ready. Jordan didn't need to be told twice. As soon as the truck skidded to a stop in front of the ER doors, he flung the door open and jumped out. Help. We need help. he shouted at the top of his lungs. A nurse burst through the sliding doors, followed by 2 paramedics pushing a stretcher. What happened? One of them demanded. Rattlesnake bite. Jordan gasped. He's been like this for over 40 minutes. The paramedics didn't waste time. They lifted Richard out of the truck and onto the stretcher, immediately hooking him up to oxygen and IV.Bs. Low, one of them muttered, "We need anti-venom, stat." Another called as they rushed Richard inside. Jordan stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind still caught in the intensity of the moment. It was out of his hands now. All he could do was wait. Jordan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see James Carter, studying him with a look of quiet approval. "You did good, kid," James said. Jordan let out a shaky breath and nodded, suddenly feeling the exhaustion hit him all at once. "I don't even know why I helped him," he muttered. James snorted. "Because that's what good people do." Jordan looked away. He wasn't sure if he believed that. Life hadn't been kind to him, so why should he care about kindness? And yet, when Richard was on the ground, dying, Jordan hadn't hesitated. He had saved him. And no idea what to do next. For the first time in a long time, Jordan had nowhere to go. The waiting room of the Nashville Regional Hospital was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Jordan sat in one of the stiff plastic chairs, his hands clasped together between his knees, staring at the double doors that led to the emergency room. Richard Montgomery had been rushed inside almost an hour ago. The nurses had asked Jordan a few questions, writing down notes about the snakebite, but eventually they had left him here, alone. Now that the adrenaline had worn off, Jordan was exhausted. His arms ached from pulling Richard through the dirt, and his legs felt like lead. His hoodie was still damp with sweat, his fingers sore from gripping that tree branch. But the worst part, he had no idea why he was still here. He had done what he could. He had gotten Richard to the hospital. The man would live or die, and it wasn't up to Jordan anymore. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Why? Because deep down, this was the first time in years that he had done something that mattered. For the past 2 years, his life had been about surviving, day by day, meal by meal. No one noticed him. No one cared, but tonight he had saved someone. A rich, powerful man who probably never would have looked at him twice in normal circumstances. A bitter part of him wondered, would Richard even remember him? Would he wake up, grateful to be alive, and immediately forget the homeless kid who had dragged him through the dirt to save his life? Probably. Jordan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Maybe it was better that way. His mother always used to say, "You don't do the right thing because you expect something back, Jordan. You do it because it's the right thing." Yeah, maybe. But that didn't make the loneliness sting any less. He exhaled sharply and stood up. Time to go. The hospital was warm, and he was tempted to stay just a little longer, but he knew better than to push his luck. Security guards didn't like homeless kids hanging around. Jordan turned and started toward the exit. Then, "Hey, kid." The voice was gruff, but not unkind. Jordan turned to see James Carter, the farmer who had given them a ride, standing near the vending machines with a cup of hospital coffee in hand. "Where you headed?" James asked. Taking a sip. Jordan shrugged. "Nowhere." James studied him for a long moment. "You ain't got a home, do you?" Jordan hesitated, then shook his head. Figured. James sighed, shifting the cup in his hands. "Look, I ain't one to pry, but you sure you don't want to stick around? Might want to hear what the doc says about your rich friend in there." Jordan frowned. "Why would I?" he asked. James gave him a knowing look. "'Cause whether you admit it or not, you care what happens to him." Jordan scoffed, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pocket. "I just didn't want him dying in front of me." James smirked. "Sure, kid. Whatever helps you sleep at night." Jordan rolled his eyes, but despite himself, he sank back into his chair. Maybe he would stay. Just a little longer. It was well past midnight when the emergency room doors finally opened. A doctor, still dressed in scrubs, walked out, flipping through a clipboard. Jordan sat up immediately. James noticed too, setting his coffee aside. "You here for Richard Montgomery?" the doctor asked, glancing between them. "Yeah," James said, jerking his thumb toward Jordan. "This kid's the reason he's still breathing." The doctor looked at Jordan more closely now, his expression shifting slightly, as if he hadn't expected to hear that. Well, the doctor said, you got him here just in time. We administered the anti-venom, and he's responding well. He'll be weak for a few days, but he's going to make a full recovery. Jordan felt his entire body relax. That's good, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. You want to go see him? The doctor asked. Jordan froze. He hadn't considered that. Go see him. What was he supposed to say? Hey, I saved your life, don't forget about me. No. That wasn't why he did this. Richard Montgomery would be fine. That was all that mattered. Jordan shook his head. Nah, I'm good, he said, standing up and stretching his stiff legs. I should get going. James frowned. Kid, you sure? Yeah, Jordan said. I did what I had to do. He doesn't need to see me. James studied him for a moment, then let out a slow nod. All right, he said. You need a ride somewhere. Jordan hesitated. It was tempting, but he knew the moment wouldn't last. James was just a nice guy passing through. People like him didn't stick around. I'll be fine, Jordan said. James looked like he wanted to argue, but in the end, he just nodded. Take care, kid. Jordan gave a lazy salute and turned toward the exit. And just like that he walked out. When Richard Montgomery finally woke up, the first thing he noticed was the sharp smell of antiseptic, the beeping of hospital machines, the sterile white ceiling overhead. The second thing he noticed was that he was alive. Pain pulsed through his leg, but it was dull now. Manageable. He tried to shift, only to feel a weight on his arm. Glancing to the side, he saw his personal assistant, Claire, slumped over in a chair, asleep, her phone still clutched in her hand. The moment he stirred, she bolted upright. Mr. Montgomery, she gasped, eyes wide with relief. You're awake. Richard groaned, pressing his fingers to his temple. What the hell happened? He muttered. Claire blinked. You don't remember? Richard frowned, his mind working sluggishly. Then it hit him. The snakebite. The dirt road. The pain. The boy. His eyes snapped open fully. Where is he? Richard asked, pushing himself up in bed. Claire looked confused. Who? The boy. Claire hesitated. Mr. Montgomery, you were brought in by a farmer, James Carter. He said there was a kid who saved you, but he left. Richard stared at her. He what? He didn't stick around, Claire said. James said he was homeless. Richard's stomach twisted. The boy had saved his life, and then just disappeared. He set his jaw. Find him. Claire blinked. Sir. Find him, Richard repeated, his voice firm. I don't care how long it takes. He owed that kid his life. And he wasn't about to let him slip away. Richard Montgomery had built his entire empire on finding things others couldn't: valuable properties, untapped markets, hidden opportunities. Now, for the first time in his life, he was using those same instincts to track down a boy who had vanished into thin air. Lying in the hospital bed, his legs still throbbing from the venom, he listened as his personal assistant, Claire, ran through the little information they had. We know his name is Jordan, she said, scanning her tablet. James Carter, the farmer who drove you to the hospital, said the kid didn't give a last name. He only said he was homeless and that he left before you woke up. Richard's jaw tightened. That's not enough, he muttered. We're working on it, Claire assured him. I've already reached out to local shelters in the area, but none of them seem to know him. If he's really been living on the streets, he might not be in the system at all. Richard exhaled sharply. Of course he wasn't. This kid Jordan had risked his own life to save him. Dragged him through the dirt, kept him awake, fought to get him here. And yet, the moment Richard was safe, he disappeared. That didn't sit right with him. He saved my life, Richard said firmly. I'm not letting him walk away like it didn't happen. Claire gave him a long, knowing look. You want to help him? Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the hospital window, watching the city of Nashville stretch out beneath the rising sun. He'd spent his whole life climbing to the top, surrounding himself with people who wanted something from him: investors, business partners, executives, even so-called friends who only cared about his money. But Jordan hadn't wanted anything. He'd just helped. Richard clenched his fists. Find him, Claire. She nodded. I'll keep digging. The next few days were a frustrating dead end. Claire's team called every homeless shelter, checked police reports, even ran a search through social services. Nothing. Jordan didn't exist, at least, not in any official record. It was like trying to find a shadow in a city of thousands. Richard, now discharged from the hospital, sat in his office, his injured leg propped up on a footrest as he flipped through reports. James Carter had been the last person to see Jordan before he vanished. That meant the only real clue they had was James. With a sigh, Richard picked up his phone and dialed the farmer's number. The line rang a few times before James picked up. Well, look who's alive, James said dryly. Richard smirked. Yeah, thanks to you and that kid, he said. Speaking of still looking for him, huh? James interrupted. Richard's expression darkened. I owe him, he said simply. James let out a thoughtful hum. You ever think maybe the kid don't want to be found? Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Doesn't matter what he wants. He saved me. I'm not walking away from that. James was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. All right. I don't know much, but I did hear something before he left. He mentioned he sleeps near the old train yard, sometimes near those busted-up warehouses on the east side. Richard's brow furrowed. That's a rough part of town. No kiddin', James said. Kid's tough, but he ain't got much. If you're serious about finding him, that's where I'd start looking. Richard nodded sharply. Thanks, James. Just don't do anything stupid, Montgomery. Not sure your leg can handle another life-threatening situation. Richard smirked. No promises. The old train yard was exactly as Richard expected: run down, rusted, and dangerous. Graffiti covered the walls. Broken glass crunched under his expensive dress shoes. The air smelled like smoke, damp wood, and desperation. Claire had insisted on sending someone else, but Richard had refused. I need to do this myself, he had told her. Now, as he stood in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, he realized just how out of place he looked. A man in a $3,000 suit, walking through a part of town where people barely had $2 to their name. He spotted a group of homeless men huddled around a barrel fire nearby. A few of them looked up, their gazes wary. Richard stepped forward. I'm looking for a kid, he said. 14, black, skinny, wears a hoodie. Name's Jordan. The men exchanged glances. One of them, a man with a graying beard and tired eyes, let out a small chuckle. A rich guy looking for a homeless kid, he mused. Now that's a first. Richard pulled a $100 bill from his pocket and held it up. I just want to talk to him, he said. That's all. The man eyed the money, then finally sighed. Kid stays low. Keeps to himself. But if he ain't at the shelter, he usually crashes in that warehouse over there. He nodded toward an old, crumbling building across the lot. Richard followed his gaze, then tossed the bill to the man before heading toward the warehouse. His heart pounded against his ribs. Would Jordan even listen to him? Would he run? Would he even be there? Richard reached the warehouse doors and pushed them open slowly. The inside was dark, with faint streaks of moonlight slipping through broken windows. Then a small movement near the far wall. Richard's eyes locked onto a familiar figure curled up on a thin blanket, tucked between two old crates, arms wrapped around himself for warmth. Jordan. Jordan. For a moment, Richard just stood there, taking in the sight of the kid who had saved his life alone. Tired, and still surviving on nothing. His chest tightened. Then, as if sensing him, Jordan's eyes snapped open. The second he saw Richard, his entire body tensed. What the hell? Jordan bolted upright, scrambling back toward the wall like a trapped animal. Richard held up a hand. Relax, kid. I'm not here to hurt you. Jordan narrowed his eyes, his breathing sharp and defensive. How the hell did you find me? I had help, Richard admitted. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. You're wasting your time. I don't want anything from you. Richard studied him carefully. Too bad, he said, stepping forward. Because I want something from you. Jordan glared. I'm not for sale, old man. Richard smirked. Good. Because I'm not offering you money. Jordan hesitated. Then what do you want? Richard's expression softened slightly. I want to help you. Jordan scoffed. Yeah. And why would you do that? Richard looked him in the eye. Because you saved my life, he said simply. Now, let me save yours. The air inside the abandoned warehouse felt heavy, stale, cold. Jordan stood rigid, his back against the wall, his dark eyes locked onto Richard with wary suspicion. He had spent years surviving in places like this, hiding in the shadows, slipping through the cracks, staying unseen. Yet somehow, this man had found him. A millionaire, standing in front of him in an expensive suit, offering something Jordan wasn't sure he could trust. "You want to help me?" Jordan scoffed, crossing his arms. "Rich guys like you don't just go around helping kids like me for nothing." Richard exhaled sharply. "I don't do things for nothing," he admitted. "But this isn't charity, kid. You saved my life. Now, I want to return the favor." Jordan let out a dry laugh. "Return the favor," he echoed. "Man, I didn't save you so you could come find me later and repay me. I did it 'cause it was the right thing to do. So whatever this is, whatever you think you owe me, just forget it." He moved to step past Richard, heading toward the warehouse doors. But Richard wasn't done talking. "I can give you a real future." Jordan. The words stopped him cold. "A real future." Jordan's shoulders tensed. "For 2 years. His future had been the next meal, the next shelter, the next night of trying to stay safe. And now this man was standing here, throwing around words like future like it was something Jordan was supposed to believe in. "I don't need your help," Jordan muttered, his voice quieter this time. Richard took a slow step forward. "Yay?" he asked. "Then tell me, Jordan, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Silence. Jordan's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening. "I don't play those games," he said. "Thinking about the future just gets you hurt." Richard's gaze softened. "That's not living, kid," he said. "That's just surviving." Jordan scoffed. "Yeah. And what would you know about surviving?" Richard hesitated. Then, for the first time, he let his carefully constructed walls crack. "More than you think." Jordan frowned, caught off guard by the shift in Richard's tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I wasn't always rich," he admitted. "I grew up in a trailer park outside of Atlanta. My dad was a drunk. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. We barely got by." Jordan's eyes narrowed. "So what? You got out. Good for you." "Yeah," Richard said. "But you know what got me out?" Jordan didn't answer. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Somebody gave me a chance." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. "A teacher," Richard continued. "She saw something in me, pushed me to work harder, gave me an opportunity when no one else would. And because of her, I got to build a life for myself." He met Jordan's guarded gaze head on. "Now, I'm offering you that same chance." Jordan shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his sides. "And what exactly is this chance?" he asked, his voice filled with skepticism. Richard didn't hesitate. "A place to stay," he said. "A real home. A shot at school, a future. A life where you don't have to sleep in places like this anymore." Jordan snorted. "And when I'm just supposed to trust you?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "You trusted me enough to save my life." Jordan froze. He had nothing to say to that. Richard exhaled. "Look, kid. I know you've been let down before. I know people have made promises and walked away. But I'm not them." Jordan shook his head. "Why do you care so much?" Richard's voice was calm, but firm. "Because I know what it's like to think no one does." Silence stretched between them. Jordan could feel the weight of Richard's words pressing into his chest, chipping away at the walls he had spent years building. A part of him wanted to believe this was real. That someone like Richard Montgomery could actually give a damn about a kid like him. But another part, the bigger part, was terrified. Because what if it was real? What if he took this chance, and it all fell apart? What if it was just another thing to lose? Jordan took a shaky breath. "And if I say no?" Richard didn't flinch. "Then I leave. And you never see me again," he said. "No strings attached. No debt. You walk away, and this conversation never happened." Jordan swallowed. "But if I say yes?" Richard's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Then you come with me, and find out what life looks like when you actually get a shot." Jordan's chest felt tight. He had spent so long looking out for himself, depending on no one, trusting no one. And now, for the first time in forever, someone was offering him a way out. A way forward. He looked around the warehouse, the cracked walls, the cold cement floor, the scraps of a life that wasn't really a life at all. Then he looked back at Richard. And finally he made a decision. Jordan exhaled sharply and rolled his eyes. "Fine. he muttered. But if you turn out to be some kind of creep, I swear to God. Richard laughed. Fair enough. Jordan hesitated, then grabbed his backpack, the only thing he owned, and slung it over his shoulder. Let's get this over with, he said. Richard nodded. All right, kid. Let's go home. And, for the first time in years, Jordan had somewhere to go. The ride back to Richard Montgomery's estate was quiet. Jordan sat in the passenger seat of the Rolls-Royce, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. The streets of Nashville, usually so familiar, felt strangely distant now. For 2 years, Jordan had roamed these streets, slipping through alleys, sleeping under bridges, keeping his head down, staying invisible. Now, he was heading somewhere he had never imagined. Somewhere called home. Richard, seated beside him, drove in silence, his injured leg still stiff from the bite. He didn't push. Didn't fill the space with empty words. He just let Jordan process. And Jordan appreciated that. Even though his mind was racing with doubts. When the car pulled up to Richard's estate, Jordan's eyes widened slightly. The house, if you could even call it that, was massive. Modern, sleek, yet warm in a way that surprised him. The driveway was lined with pristine hedges, leading up to a multi-story home with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the night sky. It looked like something out of a movie. Jordan forced himself to keep his expression neutral, even as his brain screamed, "I do not belong here." Richard noticed. Big difference from a warehouse, huh? He said casually. Jordan scoffed. Yeah. Just a little. Richard smirked. Simon. Let's get you inside. Jordan hesitated for half a second before stepping out of the car. His worn sneakers barely made a sound against the polished stone driveway. The front door swung open before they even reached it. A woman stood in the entrance, mid-30s, sharp features, dressed in business casual, arms crossed. "Finally," she said, exhaling. "You really had to go hunting through train yards for a kid right after getting out of the hospital." Richard chuckled. "Nice to see you too, Claire." Jordan recognized her name immediately. The assistant. The one Richard had sent to find him. Claire's gaze flicked to Jordan, scanning him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "So this is him, huh?" she said. Jordan crossed his arms. "Yeah, and him has a name." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Attitude. Good. You'll need that around here." Richard sighed. "Claire. Play nice." She smirked. "Fine. Welcome to the Montgomery house." Jordan gave a small nod, shifting on his feet. He wasn't used to people saying welcome to him. Claire stepped aside, motioning him in. "Come on, kid. Let's get you settled." Jordan had expected a couch, maybe a spare mattress in a side room. He did not expect a fully furnished bedroom, bigger than most apartments he'd seen. A massive bed, a desk, a closet filled with new clothes tags still on. Even TV mounted on the wall. It was too much. Jordan stood at the doorway, his stomach twisting. "This ain't mine," he said. Claire, who had been flipping through a folder, looked up. "Is now." Jordan shook his head. "Nah. This is some other rich dude's guest room. You don't gotta do all this." Richard, who had just walked in behind them, leaned against the doorframe. "I didn't have to," he said. "But I did." Jordan swallowed. He didn't trust this. Didn't trust nice things. Because in his experience, nice things always came with strings attached. Richard must have seen the conflict on his face, because his voice softened. "No expectations, kid. No debts to repay. You're here because you deserve to be." Jordan let out a slow breath. He didn't believe that yet. But maybe, just maybe, one day he would. That first night, Jordan didn't sleep in the bed. He sat in the corner instead, his back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest. It felt safer that way. His mind kept whispering, "This isn't yours. This isn't real. Don't get comfortable." By the time the morning light streamed through the window, he had barely slept an hour. But when Claire knocked on his door, announcing breakfast, Jordan forced himself up. Because if this was real, he had to try. The next few weeks were hard. Jordan wasn't used to structure, wasn't used to people telling him where to be, what to eat, what time to wake up. He bristled at the house rules. No sneaking out. No skipping meals. No sleeping on the floor. Richard was patient, more patient than Jordan expected, but he wasn't a pushover. You want to act like a stray cat. That's your choice, he said one morning, sipping his coffee. But I'm not letting you waste the chance you've got here. Jordan rolled his eyes, but deep down, the words stuck. Because for the first time in years, someone was holding him accountable. And maybe it didn't feel so bad. One afternoon, about a month after moving in, Jordan sat across from Richard in his office. Claire had just handed him a stack of school enrollment forms. Jordan stared at them for a long time. You don't have to sign them, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. But if you want a shot at something better, this is it. Jordan's fingers hovered over the papers. He had spent so long convincing himself he didn't need school, that he'd be fine on his own. But the truth. He was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of running. Tired of being nobody. He grabbed the pen. And signed his name. Richard smiled. Good choice, kid. The boy who once slept in train yards and ran from his future now walked through the doors of a prestigious high school. His backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. One still had a long road ahead, and he knew that. But for the first time in years, he believed he wasn't walking it alone. Richard had kept his word. And in return, Jordan had finally allowed himself to trust again. One evening, as Jordan sat in the living room, doing homework, Richard passed by and paused in the doorway. Hey, kid. Jordan glanced up. Yeah? Richard tossed something onto the table in front of him. Jordan picked it up. A small, worn-out bandana. The same one he had used as a tourniquet the night he saved Richard's life. His throat tightened. He looked up. Richard smirked. Just in case you ever forget what you're capable of. Jordan grinned. I won't. And, for the first time, he meant it. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.